to the Office of State Archaeology's 2018 lecture series. Throughout the year, OSA will be hosting speakers each month to present archaeological research conducted throughout the state. All lectures are free and open to the public, and this year we will be live streaming the lectures. Today it is my honor to introduce our September speaker, Mr. Shane Petersen. Shane is a staff archaeologist in the Environmental Analysis Unit of the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Shane received a BA from the University of Richmond and an MA from Duke University in Classics, where he specialized in prehistoric Aegean archaeology and worked at a late Bronze Age site in Crete. He eventually turned his research focus to North American archaeology and has worked at a number of important archaeological sites in North Carolina, including the Frederick site, a protohistoric Saria site, I think I just totally messed that up, sorry, and the Eden House site. After several years with the private archaeological research firm, Shane joined NCDOT in 1999. He is a member of the North Carolina Archaeological Council and is currently serving as president-elect of the North Carolina Archaeological Society. Today, Shane will speak about his ongoing research on one of North Carolina's most important prehistoric resources. For decades, the significance of metavolcanic stone in the technology and economics of prehistoric inhabitants of North Carolina has been recognized and incorporated into constructive narratives of the past. The recent development of identification flowchart for the determining of types of volcanic rocks in archaeological context has become an important tool in organizing the analysis of stone artifacts at sites in North Carolina. Please join me in warmly welcome Shane Petersen.
Make sure I know what I'm doing. Yep. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you all for coming to spend your lunchtime with me so that we can talk about a new approach to differentiating stone from central North Carolina and how it can help us move towards a better understanding of the earliest inhabitants of the place we call home. In our broader attempts to understand who we are as human beings and how we reach the point at which we've spread across the planet, we sought to understand those parts of our past that predate the written record. In so doing, we looked to the broadest portions of the period in which human beings have existed on the earth, and were forced to rely upon the pre-literate records of human occupation and behavior that only archaeology can access. While prehistory often encompasses those romantic earliest endeavors of human beings to organize themselves into the remarkable civilizations found on almost every continent, it also encompasses the smaller communities of human beings that pursued an alternate track and remained focused on hunter-gatherer lifestyles for a longer period. Prehistory, from another perspective, can be seen as a fundamental examination of who human beings are and what it means to be human. Progress towards answering these questions requires insights not only into human behavior of the past, but also insights into human behavior of the present time. To a degree, we're seeking a cognitive archaeology of humankind, a deeper understanding of the development of certain modes of thought in human behavior. If we're discussing prehistory as it's transmitted to us through archaeology, stone tools and the raw materials that are selected for their creation is a critical part of that discussion. For thousands of years, stone has been the medium through which human beings have sought to modify and adapt to their environment. The ability of fractured stone to keep a sharp edge vastly improved the capacity of human beings to modify and extract resources from the world around them. The adoption of stone tool technology into human behavior introduced the aspects of quality and accessibility of stone into the interactions of humans and their environment. New variables were added to the equations by which human groups organized their labor. In any community of human beings where stone materials were integrated into human lifeways, Decisions were being made that reflect basic aspects of the human condition. Among living populations, when choices are made that dramatically impact the character of human life ways, researchers have the ability to interview members of that population, conduct polls, and they can even reproduce models of behavior in laboratory settings. These are avenues towards understanding prehistory that are lost to us, but we do have evidence of these choices in the archaeological record, the stone tools themselves and the waste products that result from their creation. Naturally, therefore, it falls to archaeology to recognize and interpret the nature of those choices in a way which reflect the evolving modes of thought among prehistoric populations. To do this, archaeologists must be able to distinguish between the stone materials chosen in a way that's reliable within the context of the artifact assemblage and is comparable with analyses conducted by other researchers. This means we need an accurate and consistent nomenclature for the types of stone most frequently selected by prehistoric populations. For prehistoric people, the type of materials selected for chipped stone technology share a number of desired characteristics. Stone selected for this kind of toolkit tends to break easily under impact or pressure, but also has a small degree of elasticity that allows the material to return to its original shape following the application of stressors. Most importantly to the toolmaker, the stone needs to be consistent enough internally to allow for the transmission of force through the stone so that it breaks in predictable ways. The way the force travels through stone is often called conchoidal fracture. This means that the internal structure of the stone should preferably be amorphous, meaning it should lack any features that would divert the fracture lines into unpredictable or undesirable directions. If you can't get stone with an amorphous structure, then you want to get stone where crystals in the material are extremely small and less likely to interrupt or divert force as it passes through. Archaeologists will often call this type of stone cryptocrystalline. For thousands of years, the earliest populations in the North Carolina Piedmont had access to a wide array of breccias, tuffs, lava flows, and metamorphosed sedimentary rocks that could provide these desired characteristics. These people were occupying an area that in the very distant past, roughly 600 million years ago, had been extremely active volcanically. This area, now known as the Carolina Terrane, formed out of ancient arcs of island volcanoes from stacking lava flows and huge deposits of ash and dust in the areas surrounding them. As these island arcs were smashed into the early continental plates roughly 300 million years ago, volcanic deposits and even the sedimentary materials that had eroded and had been redeposited from earlier eruptions were folded and transformed under tremendous pressure. These metamorphosed volcanogenic rocks eventually would be exposed as outcrops or debris flows throughout much of the Piedmont and could be exploited for desired raw materials. Outside the Piedmont, in portions of the coastal plain to the southeast and the mountains to the northwest, cryptocrystalline materials like chert could also be obtained. Throughout the region, quartz that exhibits an amorphous structure if large enough crystals can be found, or quartzite that might exhibit acceptable stone matrices, could also be exploited. Together, these sources provided a wide variety of options for people to apply stone tool technologies based on their desired outcomes. The discarded tools and the waste products from their creation, which archaeologists call debitage, reflect these choices. So if lithic artifacts represent decisions made by prehistoric people based on the potential value of the material obtained, the key aspect of understanding these choices is being able to differentiate between these materials when they're encountered in archaeological contexts. This is not a new concept to researchers working in North Carolina, and many archaeologists have addressed issues related to the attribution of raw material sources in lithic assemblages. In his 1964 Formative Cultures of the North Carolina Piedmont, Geoffrey Coe noted differences in the lithic materials coming from the prehistoric quarries on Morrow Mountain in Montgomery County. In the 1990s, Randy Daniel and Bob Butler systematically examined 27 quarries in the Uwharrie Mountain region and established 5 basic types of metavolcanic raw material that were common to regional archaeological collections: ephyric rhyolite, plagioclase porphyritic rhyolite, quartz porphyritic rhyolite, plagioclase quartz, porphyritic rhyolite, and rhyolitic tuff. This was a huge step forward in our understanding of the diversity of materials used in stone tool technology in much of North Carolina. By 2006, UNC and Fort Bragg published a multidisciplinary study designed to distinguish lithic raw materials from their sources using a variety of techniques, including petrography, neutron activation analysis, neodymium isotope analysis, X-ray fluorescence, and inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. It was determined that using a number of these tests together, particularly petrography and neodymium isotope analysis, was very useful in narrowing the geographic range of quarried materials. These studies, along with a number of other more limited examinations, undoubtedly advanced our understanding of lithic raw material use in the region. But the complexity of the geology of the Carolina terrain, inconsistencies in the identification of materials and assemblages, and the expense of high-end geochemical analysis continue to plague archaeologists trying to make sense of lithic raw material use in the Piedmont. This was the situation in the early 2000s when the North Carolina Department of Transportation identified NC 24 and 27 as a strategic transportation corridor and began planning improvements along a 21-mile-long section encompassing roughly 1,300 acres south of Moore Mountain State Park in Stanley County, across the Yadkin River and through the Uwharrie National Forest in Montgomery County. This survey work, undertaken between 2006 and 2008 by archaeologists with URS Corporation and Coastal Carolina Research, resulted in the identification of 120 archaeological sites, including 111 archaeological deposits with one or more prehistoric components. Thousands of lithic artifacts were recovered by those surveys. An examination of the lithic assemblages, with more than 25 artifacts in the Montgomery County portion of the survey, reveals interesting diversity in many of the assemblages. In 2013, at the suggestion of Lee Abbott, who was with the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology at the time, I reached out to Phil Bradley of the North Carolina Geological Survey to see if we could get some help in establishing a geological background to help make sense of this diversity in lithic raw material and to better direct efforts to preserve the information reflected by these archaeological resources. A few of the archaeologists at NCDOT met with Phil and Heather at NCGS, and we started a conversation about the distribution of stone types across the Uwharrie Mountains region with reference to a project. Lee and the staff at NCGS had already been having discussions for some time about establishing a regular nomenclature for volcanogenic stone in the region that would be easily accessible to the vast majority of archaeologists working in the state. As I mentioned earlier, the problem of applying a consistent and fairly accurate system for recognizing and labeling stone artifacts from the Piedmont had been recognized as one of the major impediments to a deeper understanding of the role of stone tool technology in prehistoric lifeways of North Carolina. Heather Hanna, who was working for NCGS at the time, decided that a useful approach would be to map out her decision-making process in the most simplistic way possible for archaeologists to follow. Together, Heather and Phil created a system that would allow archaeologists to accurately describe the lithic materials encountered in archaeological contexts. Over the next few years, Heather and Phil helped me introduce this system to archaeological consultants working for DOT for use in the field. With feedback from these professionals, as well as other archaeologists and geologists with research interests in the region, the system that I'll present to you today was developed. The system is a two-tiered logic tree that should allow archaeologists to follow the basic thought process that geologists like Heather and Phil would use to identify rock that we're likely to encounter in the archaeological record. The system is not designed to work for lithic types encountered outside the North Carolina Piedmont, nor is it intended to encompass the entire range of rock types that can be encountered in the Carolina terrain. This is not a geologic identification guide. But even with these limitations, the system can appear intimidating at first blush. It looks like a lot, but the underlying structure of the logic tree is simple and consistent. Before we dive into the charts, we should talk about how to set up the analysis. Anybody that's worked with stone artifacts or has even been pretty observant about what happens to rocks when they're exposed to the elements knows that exterior surfaces weather. This weathering changes the character and appearance of the rock that's been exposed to physical and chemical factors. While there are some things that we can learn from looking at weathered surfaces, as you'll see, much of our understanding of the nature of the material is going to require that we have a fresh surface to examine. Prehistoric people would remove the weathering rind on these rocks, the cortex, to improve the predictability of their flaking. If we don't have exposed clean surfaces on representative samples, we may have to create them by breaking some artifacts, something that I know will cause many archaeologists a good deal of heartburn. But this is what we need to do to understand the nature of the material, the raw stone that was selected originally for use in the lithic toolkit. Additionally, we're going to need water and a 10 times magnification hand lens to get a good look at the structure of the stone. The first question relates to describing the texture of rock you're examining. As I mentioned earlier, the nature of the internal structure of a rock has very strong influence on its suitability as a tool. And at least most of the time, that's going to dictate its expected value. For us to try and understand the possible expected value of rock, we need to be able to describe the internal structure as best we can. So we're going to start with the first chart, tuff, lava, or sedimentary rock. Once you have your sample, you look first to describe the matrix. Does it look bumpy or grainy? As if you could see the pieces that make up the background matrix. When we talk about the matrix, we're describing the underlying ground mass of the rock, in which other pieces may or may not be suspended. I like to use the mental models of pudding or a granola bar. If the surface of your sample appears to be granular, that's to say entirely composed of smaller pieces, then it's epiclastic or granular. If your ground mass is smooth, which is to say that it doesn't appear to be entirely composed of smaller pieces in your hand lens, then it's called aphanitic. If the background matrix looks like pudding, it's aphanitic. If it looks like granola, it's epiclastic. The next question we ask ourselves is, do we see anything suspended in the background matrix? Most of the time, these other pieces, if we do see them in the matrix, are either clasts or crystals. If our sample is epiclastic, that is to say the matrix is granular, it doesn't really matter to us if the other things suspended in the matrix are clasts or crystals right now. What matters is if we see them or not. If our sample is a lava or tuff, we want to be able to tell the difference between the nature of those pieces, because if we do find them, they can help us further differentiate the lithic material. Determining the difference between clasts and crystals is sometimes pretty difficult, especially when you're new to looking at rocks in this way. Clasts are other pieces of rock that have become suspended in the lithic matrix. They may even be pieces of tuff, which are themselves aggregates of ash and other volcanic shards. Crystals are minerals that grow out of a cooling volcanic deposit. They're amorphous in their internal structure, and sometimes you can see cleavage planes or even curved conchoidal fracture. The way light reflects off these pieces can help, but you should avoid trying to tell the difference by color. Both clasts and crystals can appear in a wide variety of colors. Sometimes a rock, particularly a lava, can look splotchy. You might see ghostly spots in the matrix. This is one of the places that can trip up an archaeologist trying to accurately describe the texture of a sample. You might be tempted to see these spots as clasts or even question if the sample isn't really epiclastic. When a lava flow cools very rapidly, it can form an amorphous matrix without crystals. This is essentially volcanic glass. Over geologic time, tiny crystals can form at lower temperatures. This process is called devitrification, and it happens in very old aphanitic rocks. As I said earlier, we want to be able to tell the difference between clasts and crystals. If we've determined that we have clasts, then we want to see how they're oriented in our sample. Do they look like little flames roughly parallel to each other? Or do they look like puzzle pieces that could fit back together into a larger clast? Flame-shaped clasts are called fiamme because of the Italian word for flame. These are pieces of tuff that have been compressed and warped by heat and pressure. they can appear to be oriented along parallel planes in the stone. Fiamme-shaped clast in your rock means that it's a welded tuff. Welding occurs when the rock is so hot that the tuff, when it's deposited, is actually, those layers are actually welded together. So if you only have Fiamme-shaped clast in your sample, then you almost certainly have a welded tuff. If your rock has crystals in addition to the Fiamme-shaped clast, then you have a welded tuff with crystals. Sometimes the clasts don't look like little flames, but they do look like they were once pieces of a larger rock that fit back together. Those rocks that exhibit clasts that look like they could be roughly pieced back together like a jigsaw puzzle are called hyaloclastic. It is, of course, possible that you have clasts that are neither Fiamme-shaped nor hyaloclastic. We're now ready to consider the next structural element in the system when looking at the surface of your rock, lines or stripes. These stripes can appear on weathered, dry surfaces or wet, fresh breaks, so we'll want to look at them in both circumstances if we can. Stripes on your sample will typically mean that the rock exhibits either bedding or flow banding. Bedding and flow banding can be difficult to differentiate. Although geologists do have a number of ways to tell the difference, for our archaeological purposes, however, it's probably in our best interest and for the sake of our sanity to take the result of the logic tree at face value. Whoops. There you go. Epiclastic rocks that have clasts or crystals in their matrix but don't have stripes can be called tufaceous sandstone. Epiclastic rocks that have clasts or crystals in addition to stripes would then be called bedded tufaceous sandstone. Bedding appears as parallel lines of varying thickness, but usually, but not always, on a wet, fresh surface. This structure forms in soft sediments as a result of differences in the layers, and these beds can exhibit deformations, lines that might look like ripples in the sediments before they were cemented into stone. Sometimes bedding is discernible by touch or appearance of small ridges on the surface of a weathered sample because of differences in the way those layers weather. Epiclastic rocks that have neither clasts nor crystals in their matrix and don't have stripes can be called tufaceous siltstone. Epiclastic rocks that don't have clasts or crystals but have stripes are then called bedded tufaceous siltstone. Pretty simple. Let's see, aphanitic metavolcanics that have clasts that look like puzzle pieces but don't have stripes, we can call hyaloclastic lava. Hyaloclastic lava with lines would then be called, whoops, am I behind? There we go. Sorry. So yeah, hyaloclastic rocks, hyaloclastic rocks, you guys say it a few times, with lines would then be called flow-banded hyaloclastic lava. It's probably a good time to take a minute and talk about what we are talking about here with what flow banding is. Essentially, flow banding occurs when there's friction between the viscous lava flow and a hard rock surface. Generally, these lines are observed as parallel bands, but occasionally they can have a squiggly appearance. Flow banding can be seen as can be seen in fresh breaks of the rock, especially when wet, but they're better often observed on a weathered surface. So as we've established earlier, you may have a rock that exhibits clasts that don't look like fiamme, and they don't look like puzzle pieces. In that case, you probably have a lithic tuff. Although it's possible you have a lava, if your rock doesn't have fiamme or puzzle pieces, but has stripes in addition to clasts, then it's probably a bedded lithic tuff, or less commonly a flow-banded lava. If you observe your rock has clasts that aren't fiamme or hyaloclastic, crystals and stripes, then you probably have either a bedded crystal lithic tuff if you see more clasts, or a bedded lithic crystal tuff if you see more crystals. A less likely scenario is that you have a flow-banded lava again. Similarly, if your rock with crystals and clasts doesn't have stripes in it, and it's probably a lithic, crystallithic tuff, or a lava. Rocks that have puzzle piece clasts, as well as clasts that are either flow-banded, porphyritic, hyoclastic lava, or if you see stripes, there we go. If you've got the puzzle piece class, as well as crystals, and it's flow-banded, porphyritic, then you have flow-banded, porphyritic, hyoclastic lava. If you see stripes, or you have porphyritic, hyoclastic lava if you don't see them. The term porphyritic refers to the presence of other pieces in the matrix. If your sample has crystals, but neither clasts nor stripes, then you either have a porphyritic lava or crystal tuff, or a flow-banded porphyritic lava or bedded crystallithic tuff if stripes are present. There we go. Of course, your rock may have neither clasts nor crystals that you can see with your hand lens. Rocks with stripes are probably flow-banded lava, but can be welded tuff. Rocks without stripes are simply lava or tuff. Heather and Phil acknowledge that you may not have been able to discern the grains at a very fine siltstone, you may not have been able to discern the grains of a very fine siltstone, so they've added that as a possibility here. It's conceivable that you have something that in the matrix of your rock, particularly aphanitic rocks, that isn't a clast or a crystal. Less common textures include structures such as spherulites, which are radiating groups of crystals that can form as part of the devitrification process. Vugs, which are holes that are formed in lava or magma when gases remain trapped, or if those cavities become filled with minerals, then they're called amygdules. So far, we've described a lot about your rock just by looking at the texture of surfaces along a break. But we can find out more information about those metavolcanics, the lavas and tuffs, based on the composition of the rocks. To do this, we use the second chart that Heather and Phil have provided for us, composition of lavas and tuffs. This time, we're going to examine a dry, fresh surface with our hand lens to see how vitric the rock is. Our clue comes from looking for frosted flakes. When intermediate to felsic rocks break, small translucent fractures can form along the fresh breaks. Heather has termed these fractures frosted flakes, and I think you can see the resemblance. The more vitric the rock is, the easier it is to see these frosted flakes even without a hand lens. If you can easily see frosted flakes on a fresh, dry surface, maybe even lots, then you probably have a felsic rock. Felsic rocks are more than 65% silica. If you only see a few frosted flakes, then you probably have an intermediate lava or tuff composed of between 55 and 65% silica. If you don't see any frosted flakes on your sample, then you either have an intermediate rock or a mafic rock with less than 55% silica content. The next characteristic that we're asked to take note of is the color of the weathering rind. Typically, we'll consider this weathering rind the cortex in the lithic reduction sequence. But even the inner surfaces, the flake scars on debitage or chipped stone tools as they weather, these artifacts will also develop this color like a patina. Heather and Phil have placed a special warning on this page about the color of the weathering rind. Essentially, it can be difficult for you to accurately discern the composition of rock based on the color of the weathered surface, and that's if you even have it. So they advise you to put more weight on the observation of how vitric the sample is. Your rock may have a light-colored weathering rind of gray or cream coloring. It might also have light brown patches. This tends to happen on more felsic lavas and tuffs in the Carolina terrane, those with a higher silica content. If you see this coloring on a very vitric sample, then your rock is probably rhyodacitic or dacitic. If you see this coloring on a sample with only a few frosted flakes, then your rock is probably intermediate to felsic, which would make it andesitic to dacitic lava or tuff. A light coloring rind on a sample that isn't very vitric is pretty unlikely. According to the chart, you probably have an andesitic lava or tuff. Sometimes metavolcanic lavas and tuffs have a drab olive-brown weathering rind. It's also possible that the rind exhibits an inner layer of lighter greenish gray. If you see this coloring on a rock that exhibits obvious, large, or numerous translucent fractures on the break, then it's probably dacitic or andesitic. If your sample has very few of these frosted flakes, then it's probably andesitic. And if your lava or tuff didn't seem to have any frosted flakes on the dry, fresh break, then your sample is probably basaltic to andesitic. It's less common that a rock from an archaeological assemblage will have the dark brown rind. Rocks that exhibit frosted flakes but seem to have a dark brown rind are also pretty unlikely. In such a case, it's probable that the rock is dacitic to andesitic lava or tuff. A lava or tuff with even a few frosted flakes and a dark weathering rind is also pretty unlikely. In such a case, you probably have an andesitic rock. There we go. The most likely scenario, if you do have that dark weathering rind, is that your rock is mafic in its composition. That is to say, basaltic lava or tuff. So sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between rocks with a higher silica content from the weathering rind alone. In general, felsic rocks have a very light color on weathered surfaces, which you see on the inner rind, or sometimes as a patina on the flake scars of artifacts. On intermediate rocks, this rind, and even the weathered patina on flake scars, is a little darker. A dark brown weathering rind should be pretty distinctive. The lower silica content in mafic rocks means that you're less likely to find them as tools or debitage in a chipstone tool assemblage. So I fully realize that we've gone over a lot of material, and I don't have any expectations that anybody here has now mastered all of the pathways through the logic tree. My objective was to illustrate how a handful of observations and an understanding of a few of the more geologic terms are employed by this system to create a fairly elegant approach to differentiating the materials that show up in the majority of lithic assemblages in the Piedmont. I'm sure that most of you have already started thinking that this approach sounds well and good for a few large artifacts in an assemblage, but what about when you have hundreds or even thousands of pieces to examine? Every analyst will, of course, have their own approach to the problem, but the one I advocate most is not to look at every flake and tool. Even with this small number of observations, the task could quickly become prohibitively cumbersome. And given the fact that you'll need fresh, clean breaks to examine, this becomes problematic with diagnostic tools, which we'd prefer not to break, and smaller artifacts, which are impractical to break. For myself, I like to do a macroscopic gross sort of the material up front, and then examine a few representative samples in more detail to define the group as a whole. Is it possible that an approach like this might miss some variations? Absolutely. My approach assumes that most of the artifacts are going to fall into groups of generally similar appearance. Checking multiple examples within a single group usually confirms this suspicion. Occasionally, an artifact or even a few artifacts exhibit some small variant that probably represents either limitations on our observation based on the size of the artifact or a small variation in the way the material manifests at the extraction site. For example, some flakes may be simply too small to exhibit flow banding in a way that can be easily discerned. Or perhaps one part of a quarry exhibiting tuff has more crystals in one portion and more clasts in another. One of the other concerns I hear frequently, essentially boils down to a concern about making a mistake in the analysis, or that maybe other archaeologists making observations would label something differently than a geologist would. The truth is, you're probably going to make mistakes, especially in the beginning as you're learning what to look for. And there will be other specialists that will certainly describe your samples differently from you. This is not something that should paralyze us with inaction. The most important aspect of your analysis is to be consistent in the way that you answer the questions in the logic tree throughout your examination. In other words, if you're going to be wrong, be consistently wrong. This approach makes it much easier for other archaeologists approaching the same materials with the same system to reconstruct your observations. Since the development of Heather and Phil's system, we've been using this approach to classify raw materials for prehistoric sites in the Piedmont recovered from NCDOT projects. We've employed this on projects at the survey and evaluation levels, and also on larger data recovery projects in places like along the Rocky River, in the vicinity of Asheboro, and around Fayetteville. Essentially any place that we expect lithic materials that were extracted from the Carolina terrain. One interesting application, and one of our first opportunities to employ the logic tree came with the required mitigation work at Site 31MG 1910. In many ways, 31MG 1910 was a great site to test and develop the identification process. Located on the top of a ridge-toe extending between small drainages, the site had undergone the kinds of post-depositional disturbances that are all too common in much of the Piedmont uplands: bioturbation, soil deflation, and logging. In the case of 31MG 1910, the compression and mixing of archaeological deposits remained a severe challenge. But fortunately, the lack of significant slope across the 1,400 square foot core of the site meant that horizontal positions were fairly close to their relative depositional situations. Even so, the post-depositional site transformation meant that excavators and analysts were going to have severe difficulties extracting meaningful information from the site. The chipstone tools and types of debitage resulting from tool creation and maintenance that were represented in the assemblage revealed a few interesting details. The site was occupied intensively over a very long stretch of time before the first Europeans came to North Carolina. A substantial number of projectile points were collected from excavations ranging from early Archaic corner notch points to points dating to the end of the Archaic period, when human populations in the southeast were beginning to adopt newer technologies like horticulture and ceramics. The site also had a limited Mississippian-related component that produced ceramics, but probably contributed to the lithic assemblage as well. Despite this broad range of components covering thousands of years of occupation, the assemblage is pretty consistent in a few ways. In addition to the points, only one drill, 2 choppers, and 5 expedient tools were identified in an assemblage with nearly 15,000 artifacts. A few cores and a fair number of bifaces in varying stages of reduction were identified as well, but the kinds of tools associated with long-term occupation appeared to be absent. Very few ad hoc tools, flakes employed to a task with little or no modification, were recovered. Debitage from the site suggested that biface creation and other stone reduction was occurring, as well as tool maintenance like sharpening, but most of the early processing of raw materials, usually the removal of the weathering rind, seems to have been completed elsewhere. Without a deeper consideration of the raw materials, researchers at this site could tell when the site was occupied, and they could make educated guesses about what the site wasn't, but they really couldn't do much more. When the lithic identification guide was applied to the assemblage from Site 31MG 1910, 15 lithic material types were observed. If variants within types are counted, the number of raw material types jumps up to 28. This site was one of those examined to demonstrate the role of diversity in the artifact assemblages along the NC 2427 corridor. That analysis in 2008 only counted 6 types, including quartz, other, and indeterminate. The types of materials identified at 31MG 1910 ranged from high-quality felsic to intermediate lavas or tuffs, to a local highly weathered metavolcanic rock, and volcanogenic metasedimentary materials, such as tufaceous siltstone or sandstone. Quartz was also present in a large portion of the lithic assemblage, and there were a few oddball materials in the collection, like a possible diorite, which is a very hard mafic rock. A very general look at the raw materials represented by the projectile points that were deposited at the site could be interpreted to represent a general shift in raw material selection from more felsic, etheric lavas and tuffs earlier in the Archaic period to a broader range of raw material choice that becomes more tolerant of crystals and clast porphyries, and even sedimentary materials as the Archaic period progressed. As noted above, the compression and vertical mixing of archaeological components covering most of the Archaic period, and at least part of the terminal woodland period at the site makes temporal associations with raw material selection very difficult. There are, however, a few observations that can be gleaned from the application of the lithic identification system that might otherwise have remained obscure. The classification of as many as 20 types of metavolcanic raw materials utilized at the site emphasizes the broad range of sources employed by populations at this location. Preferences for a handful of types, such as metarrhyodicitic to metadicitic lava or tuff, ferric lava and tuff, and even heavily weathered aphanitic lava or tuff, which was labeled type 5, indicate strong preferences for particular raw materials in chipstone tool production at the site. These types are strongly represented in unfinished or partial bifaces and debitage in the assemblage. By comparison, quartz, which was the most abundant raw material recovered from the site, does not appear among the finished tools and is only abundant in unspecialized interior flakes and shatter. Additionally, the lithic identification system allowed for the classification of a number of less well-represented metavolcanic types, including a severely weathered volcaniclastic rock that was termed type 6. This relatively poor quality rock was reported to have been locally available and appears as a minor component of debitage at the site. It may have been tested for suitability as a material for bifaces. Even without the benefit of comparisons to known quarry locations for other sites, this assemblage suggests that there are particular biases and range effects dictating the estimated utility of a material in the lithic toolkit over time. The site even suggests remarkable consistency among some biases over very long stretches of time and varying technology, while other reference points appear to shift. In February 2017, changes to a small portion of the Troy bypass necessitated a revisit to a portion of Site 31MG 1910 that hadn't been excavated during the earlier investigations. A few shovel tests and surface collections were made to determine the nature of those areas in comparison to the excavated portions of the site. While the surface collections and subsurface tests only produced a small collection of 20 artifacts, this provided us an opportunity to test replicability of results by using the lithic identification system. It became very quickly apparent that I could easily fit the new collection into types established 2 years earlier by the analysts with Coastal Carolina Research, with most of the new assemblage falling into the categories of previously identified types 1, 2, 2A, and 5 for the site. Clearly, the real strength of this system will become apparent once it's more universally applied to lithic assemblages throughout the region. After as many lithic raw material extraction sites are identified as possible, and those materials are categorized as well. This lithic identification system should be in no way considered as a substitute for the powerful petrographic and geochemical tools that have been suggested by the researchers at Fort Bragg and UNC. The system allows for differentiation of materials within an assemblage and certainly can be used to formulate hypotheses regarding raw material choice among larger groups of sites. But geochemical and petrographic profiles of the materials available in prehistoric quarry locations will be necessary to confirm associations. As prehistoric groups move through and adapt to their environment, they're faced with economic decisions with regards to the maintenance and flexibility of their lithic toolkit. These decisions can essentially be characterized as explore, exploit trade-off choices. Foraging populations are faced with a dilemma in which they must choose between utilizing known resources or incurring costs to seek new ones. The expected rational choice would be that a group would exploit known resources with the highest expected utility to satisfy their immediate needs. In an environment where high-quality resources are abundant, like the Carolina Terrane in general and the Uwharrie Mountains region in particular, it would be expected that explore choices would be optimal due to the much lower risk of failure to obtain lithic materials with a relatively high expected utility. This is to say that prehistoric populations should be able to find suitable, if not superior, lithic raw material without too much difficulty, and would be expected to test lots of materials over the landscape. While environmental conditions, in addition to other factors such as biological need and brain chemistry, can certainly influence decisions and explore-exploit trade-offs, the lithic raw materials with the highest expected utility should not change. Stone that consistently flakes in a predictable pattern to produce desired sharp edges, and the tools with the desired morphology should always be highly valued. But as we see at Site 31MG 1910 and lots of other sites throughout the Piedmont, the heuristics guiding raw material choice are not only complicated, but they shift over time. I think that understanding the factors and biases that drive choice among prehistoric populations should feel familiar to us today, even if we think we might make different choices in the same circumstances. But the only way for us to look at the behavior and compare it to choices we make in our own life ways is to be able to differentiate between the options. Thanks. That was a lot. So I have no idea how long I went, but if you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Maybe. If you guys buy me lunch. It was that good, huh? You guys just wowed by all that information. No. Heather is probably, she said she might watch it on the live stream so that she can send me notes as to all the things I screwed up later. No, I'm teasing. She's not doing that. She said she might watch it. They are very busy. Cool. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for coming.
On behalf of the Office of State Archaeology, I would like to thank Shane for sharing his time and research with landscapes. Events will include several lunchtime lectures and student research symposiums, an evening keynote speaker lecture, and as well as Public Archaeology Day on October 27th at the Bicentennial Plaza, with vendors and events for all ages. Our next event will be a lunchtime lecture talk by Jim McKee on October 4th entitled Reach for the Channel, History and Archaeology of Channel Improvements on the Cape Fear River. Be sure to check out our website, archaeology.ncdcr.gov, for more information on the upcoming events and lectures. Thank you.